She boarded the plane with quiet grace, no entourage, no special requests, just a woman in a linen blouse and a calm, almost distant look in her eyes. No one knew she was the CEO of the very airline they were flying on, not the passengers, not the pilot, and certainly not the flight attendant who would soon slap her in front of an entire cabin. But why did she say nothing? Why didn't she reveal her identity right away? And most of all, what happened next, when the truth came out, shocked the entire aviation world. This isn't just a story about power and prejudice. It's about what happens when assumptions take flight and when one woman chooses empathy over ego to spark a cultural reckoning at 30,000 feet. Who was this mysterious passenger? What led to the unforgettable confrontation, and what message did a teenage boy with autism whisper to her? That changed everything. Get ready for a story that will break your heart, challenge your beliefs, and leave you in awe. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, buckle up, this journey's about to begin. The line at Gate 17 snaked slowly forward as Flight AL409 prepared for boarding. The hum of suitcase wheels over the tile floor, quiet announcements overhead, and the occasional sigh from a weary traveler created a familiar airport rhythm. Avery Langston stood calmly at the back of the priority line, blending in with the understated ease of someone who had traveled 1,000 times before. A soft gray coat draped over one arm, her scarf, a muted navy with fading edges, hung loose around her neck. Her shoes were polished but plain, her posture upright but not demanding. She didn't need to draw attention. She had long since learned that power rarely had to shout. When they called Group 1, she stepped forward, her digital boarding pass glowing faintly on her phone. No one gave her a second glance. Not yet. Inside the jet bridge, a chill draft ran along the walls. Avery breathed in the familiar metallic scent of airplane cabin air. It was always the same, comforting, in a strange way. This was her domain, even if no one here knew it yet. She stepped on board with a quiet nod toward the crew. "Good evening." The young flight attendant at the front glanced up briefly from her tablet. Her lips curved into a professional smile, but her eyes lingered too long on Avery's coat. Then her gaze dropped to Avery's shoes, then rose again with a tilt of confusion or perhaps judgment. "Hello, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice brisk. "Are you looking for Coach? It's down that way." She gestured toward the back. Avery's lips lifted just slightly. "I'm in 3A. The flight attendant blinked. "First class?" "Yes." Avery held up her phone, but the attendant didn't look at the screen. Instead, she tilted her head and took a small step forward, lowering her voice only slightly. "I'm sorry, but that seat is reserved for our Platinum Elite members. I think you may have been upgraded incorrectly." A pause hung in the air. Avery's voice remained warm, steady. "I booked it." Another flicker of hesitation passed over the attendant's face, just a flicker, before the mask of confidence returned. "Of course." "May I just see your boarding pass again?" Avery extended the phone. The name glowed clearly on the screen. Avery Langston, 3A, Astralinks Airlines. The attendant barely glanced at it before waving her hand dismissively. "I'll just double-check with the system. Please step aside while I confirm." Passengers began lining up behind her, forcing the attendant to move things along. A second crew member arrived older, more experienced, with gentle gray eyes that took in the tension at a glance. She nodded quietly to Avery and motioned toward the seat. "You're welcome to sit, ma'am. We'll sort this out shortly." Avery nodded and walked to seat 3A, placing her bag beneath the seat ahead of her. She sat with poise, resting her hands lightly on her lap. Outside the window, the tarmac glowed under floodlights. She focused on the distant motion of a baggage truck, and then she heard the sharp click of heels approaching. The same attendant returned. "Ma'am," she began again, her tone sharper now. "I need to ask you to move. This seat has been allocated to a loyal executive traveler. We cannot allow Avery turned to face her. I am the traveler." The attendant's expression hardened. "You're not understanding. This seat is not yours. I'm going to need to reseat you, immediately." A few heads in first class turned toward the exchange. Avery didn't raise her voice. She simply unlocked her phone, tapped once, and held the screen up again. Same boarding pass, same name, same seat. The attendant stared, and then she snapped. In a sudden motion, she reached out not for the phone, but for Avery's wrist. She slapped the phone from her hand. It hit the armrest with a dull thud, bouncing to the floor. Gasps broke out from the rows ahead. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." A child peeked through the seat in front. The older flight attendant rushed over. Jade, but Avery didn't flinch. She simply bent, picked up the phone, and straightened again. Her eyes were calm, but no longer soft. "That was a choice," she said, her voice measured, "not a mistake." Jade Merrill, the flight attendant, suddenly looked around, sensing the weight of 100 eyes on her. Her face flushed, her mouth opened to speak, but nothing came. A silence fell over the cabin, thick and full of static, the kind that made you hold your breath. And Avery Langston, CEO of Astralinks Airlines, sat quietly in 3A, waiting. The air had changed. It wasn't just the hum of the overhead vents or the shuffle of boarding passengers behind the curtain. It was something heavier tension, like static before a storm. Jade Merrill stood frozen, her hand half raised as if to take back what had already happened. The flush in her cheeks deepened with every passing second. The woman in 3A hadn't moved. She simply stared back, not with anger, not even surprise, but with a calm so unnerving it felt like judgment. Quiet judgment. Jade glanced over at Lena Navarro, the senior attendant, hoping for backup. But Lina was watching her with something different in her eyes. Not anger, not panic. Sadness. "Jade," Lena said, stepping forward gently, "go check in with the gate agent. Now." But now, the order was firm, not loud, but final. Jade swallowed and turned, heels clacking hard against the floor as she exited the cabin, brushing past incoming passengers. Avery Langston exhaled slowly, gaze still out the window. When Lena leaned closer, her voice was softer than before. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Avery turned. "Yes. Thank you." Lena gave a small nod, unsure of what else to say. There was a flicker of recognition, a sense that maybe she knew who Avery was, but she said nothing. Instead, she gently offered a glass of water. Avery accepted it with a nod. In the row ahead, a woman leaned sideways, whispering to her husband. Did she just get slapped? No idea, but that flight attendant's in trouble. The murmur spread like ripples in still water. Meanwhile, Jade burst through the terminal doors, heart racing. The fluorescent lights above Gate 17 felt too bright. She spotted the gate agent, a younger man with a tired expression and badge that read Oliver Boone. Hey, that woman in 3A, she's not supposed to be there. Something's wrong with the manifest. Oliver blinked at her, then typed quickly on his screen. A pause. Then his eyes widened just slightly. Jade. What she's listed here. He turned the monitor toward her. Full fare. Booked a week ago. Verified ID. Jade stared. No, that can't be right. That seat's usually held for executive tiers. We don't just give that away to Oliver Cut-In. She didn't get it given. She paid, and Jade, her name's Avery Langston. Jade blinked. Langston, yeah. Why, her voice was barely above a whisper now. You're sure? Oliver slowly turned the monitor toward her again. This time he pointed to the full name, Avery Langston. Jade stepped back like she'd been slapped herself. Back on the plane, boarding was nearly finished. A teenage boy with noise-canceling headphones stepped into row 4 and carefully examined the overhead bins, avoiding eye contact with everyone. He moved with mechanical precision, placing his backpack just so, smoothing out his hoodie, double-checking the seat number. Avery noticed him. Noticed the way he folded himself into his seat, arms tucked close, eyes trained on a safety card he didn't read. He looked like someone trying not to be seen. In the galley, Lena confronted Jade, who had just returned looking pale. She's not who you thought. Is she? Jade shook her head. Slowly, Lena sighed. Jade, do you realize what you've done? I didn't know, Jade whispered. She looked so Lena held up a hand. Exactly. She looked, and that was enough for you. Jade opened her mouth, but the weight of her mistake made the words catch in her throat. She didn't even raise her voice. Lena continued. That woman showed more restraint in 30 seconds than I've seen from passengers in years. Jade lowered her gaze. At the front of the plane, Captain Theo Vance stepped out of the cockpit. Tall, composed, and in his late 50s, he carried himself with the relaxed confidence of a man who had weathered storms, literal and otherwise. Everything all right out here? He asked. Lena spoke before Jade could. We had an incident with a passenger. Theo raised an eyebrow. Which one? Lena gestured toward 3A. He glanced over and stopped. His expression changed instantly. Langston? He asked, under his breath. Lena nodded. Theo looked at Jade. Did you know who she was? Oh. Jade admitted. Theo gave a slow, steady breath. Let me talk to her before this flight becomes a PR disaster. He approached Avery's seat, adjusting the lapel of his uniform. Ms. Langston. Avery looked up. Captain Vance, she said calmly, still flying the east routes. I see. His expression softened. Some habits die hard. They exchanged a quiet moment of familiarity. Not friendship exactly, but something respectful. Earned. Apologies for the turbulence, he said gently. Avery gave a faint smile. The plane hasn't left the ground yet. Still, he said, I'd like to extend a personal apology on behalf of the crew. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm not here as the CEO today. Theo, I'm just flying to Lisbon. I understand, but I will follow up. His nod was slow, deliberate, of course. At the rear galley, Jade leaned against the counter, hands shaking slightly. Her thoughts were chaos. I didn't mean to. She didn't look like someone who belongs there. But what does that even mean? What does that say about me? She heard a ping from her phone. A message from the crew group chat girl. Is it true? You slapped the CEO, her stomach twisted. Her whole career hanging by a thread. The cabin lights dimmed as the final overhead bins clicked shut. Seatbelt signs glowed gently across the rows, casting faint halos on the passengers' shoulders. Jade Merrill stood stiffly at the galley door, watching from the corner of her eye as the woman she'd misjudged insulted, sat quietly in seat 3A, sipping water as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and now Jade couldn't stop hearing the words she hadn't meant to say aloud. The words that had been loud in her mind from the moment Avery Langston stepped on board. "You don't look like first class." She had thought it. Then she had said it. Then she had acted on it. And now, here they were, wheels up in 10, and her heart sinking even faster. Meanwhile, in seat 3A, Avery sat composed but inwardly wrestling with a familiar ache. She'd spent years designing this airline to reflect values she cared deeply about: accessibility, excellence, respect. She'd trained staff, led culture-building retreats, reviewed every passenger complaint with personal attention. But in this moment, she wasn't a CEO, she was a mirror, one that had reflected someone's worst assumptions back at them, and it stung more than she'd expected. She'd been mistaken for many things before: assistant, secretary, intern, but rarely had she been handled, and certainly never on her own aircraft. Her fingers brushed lightly across her phone screen. No emails, no alerts, just her reflection in the black glass, eyes tired. She glanced across the aisle. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit gave her a tight-lipped smile, the kind that held both apology and discomfort. He had witnessed the whole thing, but said nothing. Silence can be louder than words. In row 4, the teen boy, Connor Dre, had begun to rock gently in his seat. Not visibly, just enough. A rhythm, a pattern. He noticed things others didn't. The way the woman in front of him didn't press her call button but needed help. The way the flight attendant had spoken too fast and too loud to her. The way her eyes had gone still instead of angry. He scribbled something in the corner of a puzzle book. 2 boxes, a line between them, a small stick figure near one side. Then he drew a speech bubble above it that said, "She doesn't look like you think." Then he erased it. In the galley, Jade's hands shook as she filled the drink trays. Lena appeared beside her, calm as always. "She's not yelling," Jade whispered. "No," Lena replied, "because she doesn't need to. She's dangerous, isn't she?" Lena turned to her slowly. "No, she's disappointed." That word hit harder than a warning. Disappointed. "I didn't mean to. I just thought," Jade began. "That's the problem," Lena interrupted, gently but firmly. "You thought, and you didn't ask." As the plane pulled back from the gate, the safety video began to play. Avery didn't watch. She'd seen every frame of it 100 times in the editing room. Her mind drifted back to a conversation she'd had with Eli, her late brother and co-founder. "We're not just building an airline," he had said. "We're building a message in motion. We're showing the world what fairness looks like 35,000 feet up." And yet, here she sat. The message crumpled beneath a slap and a stare. A sudden jolt brought Avery back. Not turbulence, just a drink cart thumping slightly on a ridge in the floor. Jade was pushing it now, silently, robotically, avoiding her eyes. "Would you like a drink?" she asked stiffly. Avery looked up, considering. "I'm fine." Jade nodded, but something inside her cracked a little at the words. She couldn't even offer a glass of water without feeling the shame swirl back up. Farther back, a writer in business class named Noel Stroud tapped away at her tablet, lips pressed together. She'd seen it all. She'd seen everything. And now she was writing. She didn't know the woman's name yet. She only knew the story was bigger than a slap, bigger than a seat dispute, bigger than a bruised ego. It was about something deep and bitter, something that lived quietly in uniforms and systems and eyes. Noelle had flown 1,000 flights. She had seen assumptions made every time a passenger didn't look the part. Black mother mistaken for nanny. Latina woman offered cleaning wipes instead of menus. Muslim teen asked to step aside for additional screening. But today, someone powerful had been mistaken, and power remembered. Back in the cockpit, Captain Theo Vance stared ahead through the windshield at a blank sky. His co-pilot flipped switches. "Something's wrong out there," Theo said quietly. "You mean the weather?" "No," he replied. "On board." The co-pilot glanced back. "Want to ground the flight?" Theo shook his head. Too late for that. The truth's already airborne. And in 3A. Avery closed her eyes briefly and whispered to herself, "Don't show them anger. Show them who you are." A vow, because she hadn't come on this flight just to visit Lisbon. She had come to observe her company, to ride anonymously, to test the heart of the system she had helped build. But the system had failed her, and now she would show them what accountability looked like, not through shouting, but through silence, through presence, through truth. As Flight AL-417 cruised steadily above the Atlantic, the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin like a lullaby wrapped in steel. Overhead, lights dimmed, passengers settled into their movies, books, or silence. But in seat 3A, Avery Langston wasn't watching anything. Her eyes were open, but turned inward, reliving 1,000 boardrooms, 1,000,000 decisions, and one moment that had unraveled them all. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had flown anonymously to see how well her values traveled, and she had been reminded violently that anonymity for someone like her came with assumptions. Wrong ones. She could hear Jade Merrill's voice echoing in her memory. "This seat is for platinum elites. You must have been upgraded by mistake." And then, the slap. It wasn't just the contact. It was the certainty behind it. The conviction that someone like her didn't belong. That she had to be corrected, redirected, removed. Avery exhaled slowly, closing her eyes again. A few rows back, Lena Navarro stood by the galley, watching the cabin, but mostly watching Jade. The younger woman had folded herself into the corner like a paper crane, sharp and defensive. Lena approached gently. "You can't fix it by hiding," she said softly. Jade didn't look up. "I thought I was helping. I thought I was protecting the seat for someone important." "You were," Lena replied. "You just didn't recognize her. That landed hard." Jade swallowed. She looked regular. Lena nodded, because powerful women often do, especially the wise ones. Jade turned, her voice cracking just slightly. "What do I do now?" Lena leaned in closer. "You listen, you learn, and then you stop assuming who deserves a seat at the top." In the cockpit, Captain Theo Vance tapped his fingers on the logbook. "She's not just a passenger," he muttered aloud. His co-pilot raised a brow. "You know her." Theo nodded once. "I've flown her before. Last year, company retreat to Denver. She was in the jump seat touring every section of the plane, talking to cleaning staff, mechanics, everyone, and she didn't speak like a figurehead. She asked about fuel systems, scheduling, supply chain stress points. She knew our routes better than ops." The co-pilot blinked. "She's the real deal. She is Astra Lynx," Theo said. "That woman back there built this airline from nothing. She doesn't take PR flights, she takes pulse checks." He paused, and this time, the pulse is sick. Back in first class, a whisper passed between the passengers. "That's her." She's the CEO. Wait, the one in 3A. She got slapped. Oh my God. Avery noticed it, but didn't react. She'd been whispered about before, but usually it was in glass offices, over espresso. With admiration, this was different. This was pity laced with guilt. And yet, it wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt was remembering why she'd come here. She had planned to meet with ground staff in Lisbon, hear their concerns, address union tension quietly, human to human. But now, the story had shifted. She wasn't an ally here. She was a symbol, a headline. Airline CEO assaulted on her own flight. She sighed. That's not what I wanted. Not revenge, not media attention, just awareness. And maybe, somewhere beneath that, healing. In row 4, Connor Dre tore a page from his notebook. He crept down the aisle toward 3A, his movements calculated, respectful. When he reached her seat, he didn't speak, just placed the folded paper gently on her tray table. Then he turned and walked back. Avery unfolded it. Inside was a drawing, a woman standing in the aisle, small lines above her head indicating motion, a red X over another figure with a hand raised, and beside it, in neat handwriting, I saw what they didn't. You're not invisible. Her breath caught. She looked up, eyes scanning the cabin, catching the boy's soft gaze before he quickly looked away again. That was all she needed. Not a crowd, not applause. Just one person who saw clearly. Meanwhile, in row 5, Noelle Stroud, the writer, had begun rewriting the piece she'd started earlier. The title changed from Bias in the Skies to The Woman in Seat 3A. She added a line she wasn't sure would make the final version. Sometimes, the highest seats carry the deepest silence, and sometimes, the quietest passengers hold the loudest truths. The seatbelt sign chimed. Turbulence. Passengers straightened, cups slid, trays rattled. Jade's heart jumped. She rushed to secure the galley but dropped a metal scoop. It clanged against the cart. She froze. Then soft footsteps. Avery stood there, still calm, still gracious. She bent and picked up the scoop, handed it back without a word. Their eyes met, and, for the first time, Jade saw something beyond rank. Beyond rage, something both terrifying and tender restraint. That kind of strength couldn't be taught in the training modules. It came from living through storms and choosing not to become one. Later, as the plane steadied, Jade approached again, this time without a tray or excuse. I owe you an apology, she said, voice low. Avery looked at her, holding her gaze. Jade continued. I didn't see you. I didn't want to be wrong. Avery nodded once, then said gently, You didn't want to be uncomfortable. That's different. Silence. I'm learning, Jade offered. Avery's response came slowly, but clearly. Then make sure your next passenger doesn't have to teach you the same lesson. The cabin lights dimmed further as the Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath them. Somewhere over open water, where borders blur and nations disappear beneath clouds, the truth floated quietly undeniable and suddenly unavoidable. Avery Langston leaned back in her seat, one hand gently resting on the armrest, the other holding the folded drawing that Connor Dry had given her. She traced the lines again, a child's sketch, simple, imperfect, but precise in its emotional clarity. It wasn't about artistry, it was about recognition. You are not invisible. Funny, she thought, after all these years of building Astralinks, sitting in boardrooms surrounded by suits who needed reminders of her authority, it had taken a child to say what mattered. Not you are important. Not you are powerful. But you are seen. Back in the crew galley, Jade Merrill gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles pale. She couldn't stop replaying it. The way her voice had snapped, the flash of her hand, the crack of palm against cheek, and then the stillness. No shouting, no retaliation. Just a woman who took the blow and looked back with quiet, devastating grace. Jade pressed her eyes shut. Why did she react that way? Why that much anger? Because the woman didn't fit the image she expected in that seat. Because she reminded Jade of herself. Once desperate to belong, or was it deeper resentment buried under years of striving in a system built for someone else? She didn't know anymore. In the cockpit, Captain Theo Vance monitored autopilot but found his thoughts drifting again. He'd flown for nearly 30 years, seen all kinds of passengers, but none like her. Avery Langston wasn't just a CEO. She was a simple one who had deliberately stepped down from her pedestal to experience the business from a passenger's view. And what had she found? That the sky, even at 35,000 feet, wasn't high enough to escape bias. He tapped the comm. Cabin crew, report when ready. His voice was steady, but his mind raced. He had a duty not just to land the plane, but to help land a lesson. A few rows back, Noelle Stroud continued scribbling in the margins of her notepad. This wasn't just a story anymore. This was a story. A woman judged by her appearance, assaulted in silence, and yet she didn't fire back. She waited. What kind of patience does it take to absorb violence, not respond, and still hold space for the person who harmed you? Noelle underlined a phrase in bold. She wore dignity like armor, and still chose not to wield it as a weapon. Meanwhile, Connor Dre leaned against his mother's shoulder, humming softly. His fingers tapped invisible keys, his way of self-soothing when the world became too much. He didn't fully understand what had happened, but he felt it, the tension in the air, the quiet shame, the storm in grown-up hearts. But he had seen something, too, a woman who didn't flinch, who didn't fight fire with fire. He liked her. She reminded him of his therapist, Dr. Renna. Calm eyes, gentle voice, someone who didn't need to shout to be strong. Connor closed his eyes. In first class, Avery turned her attention outward again. Across the aisle, a flight attendant was softly apologizing to an elderly man for a spilled drink. A tiny act of accountability, a flicker of compassion. Small things, but they mattered. Then she caught Jade's reflection in the window approaching slowly, like someone walking into their own storm. "May I sit?" Jade asked. Avery nodded. For a moment, they sat in silence. The only sound was the distant hum of the engines and the quiet tremble of remorse. Jade finally spoke. "When I first started flying, I was scared I didn't belong here. I worked twice as hard to prove myself, smiled harder, memorized every manual. I was proud until I wasn't." Avery said nothing. "I looked at you and, I don't know, I saw someone who hadn't earned it, who was just sitting there." She looked down. "I was wrong." Avery turned to her, voice low but firm. "You weren't wrong to want excellence. You were wrong to weaponize your standards." Jade swallowed. "I don't expect forgiveness." Avery considered this. "I'm not offering it," she said. "Not yet." Jade nodded. "But I'm offering something else." Avery continued. "A choice." Jade looked up. "You can stay angry and small or you can grow. But growth costs something. It always does." As the plane continued across the ocean, quiet moments unfolded like petals. A mother comforted a child. A stranger handed a charger to someone whose phone had died. Lena helped an elderly man to the restroom. It was as if the cabin itself had exhaled. The aggression had torn something open, but now healing was leaking through the cracks. And in 3A, the woman no one saw was quietly beginning to reshape the atmosphere around her. Not with titles, not with orders, but with presence. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Headlines, meetings, board calls. But right now, there was just a plane in the sky, a flight mid-air between what had been and what could be next, and a woman, still steady, still watching, still choosing not to rise in rage, but to wait for the right moment to lift everything. The cabin seemed quiet now, but beneath the hum of jet engines, a different kind of turbulence churned. Not the kind the seatbelt light warned you about. This one was quieter, more human, more dangerous. It moved in the tightness behind eyes that refused to meet others, in the shuffling of feet when someone passed the aisle too slowly, in the unspoken words caught behind polite smiles. Flight AL-417 was cruising steadily through smooth air, but inside, something had cracked open, and everyone felt it. Avery Langston pressed her fingers against her temple, eyes closed. A dull ache had settled in, not from the slap that sting had faded hours ago. No, this was something deeper, a weariness that came not from confrontation, but from recognition. She'd hoped, truly hoped, that things had changed, that flying under the radar in her own company might show her how far they'd come. But what she saw, what she felt, it was the same thing she'd battled as a young woman on her first day in aviation finance. The raised eyebrows, the presumptions, the questions that were never asked of anyone else. Back then, she had something to prove. Now, she had something to protect. And it wasn't just a brand or a reputation, it was integrity. It was the truth. In the crew galley, Jade Merrill had stopped moving. She stared at the small silver pin on her uniform wings that once meant so much. She remembered pinning it on the day she got promoted from reserve. Her mother had cried. Her girlfriend had whispered, "You earned this. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small." But now she had to face the reality she had made someone else feel small. Worse, she'd done it with her authority, and not just anyone, her CEO. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal of the overhead bin. The hum of the plane felt louder in the silence of her thoughts. Would she still have a job when they landed? And more importantly, did she deserve to? In the cockpit, Captain Theo Vance had been quiet too long. His co-pilot glanced over. "You good?" Captain Theo nodded slowly. "Yeah, just thinking." The younger pilot chuckled. "I didn't think captains thought. I thought we just read gauges and drank bad coffee." Theo smirked, but it faded quickly. "You ever hear of a CEO riding coach on their own airline?" he asked. The co-pilot paused. "That woman, the one in 3A. "Yep, no way. She's the CEO." Theo nodded again. The co-pilot let out a slow whistle. "Damn. What happened?" Theo didn't answer right away. He just looked ahead out into the night, at the endless stretch of black sky and the thousands of feet of silence beneath them. "What always happens," he finally said, "people assume, people react, people forget that dignity doesn't come with a label." Noelle Stroud was writing again. Her fingers moved quickly, but not with excitement, with urgency. She didn't know how this story would end, but she knew what it meant. A woman who could have fired half the plane, who didn't. A flight attendant unraveling under the weight of her own assumptions. An airline, a system being tested from the inside out. Turbulence doesn't always shake the plane. She scribbled. Sometimes it shakes the soul. She glanced toward 3A, watching Avery's still posture. Composed, controlled, but not numb. Noelle saw it now, the effort it took to be that calm. The years it must have taken to build a shield so smooth no one could see the armor beneath. Further back in row 11, Connor Dre sat with headphones on. His favorite song was playing slow piano chords, no lyrics, just music that made him feel like he was floating. He didn't understand everything adults said, but he knew feelings, he knew shame, he knew fear, and he knew kindness. The lady in 3A had looked at him like he mattered, not as a kid, not as someone different, but as Connor. So he drew her another picture. This time, it was of a woman in the clouds' arms, open, not falling, but flying. Avery opened her eyes as someone approached. It wasn't Jade. It wasn't a passenger. It was Lena Navarro, the senior flight attendant. "May I?" Lena asked, motioning toward the open seat beside her. Avery nodded. Lena sat, her hands folded neatly. "I won't take long," she said. "I just wanted to say I saw everything, and I should have spoken up earlier." Avery looked at her, calm, curious. "I've been flying for 19 years, Lena continued, "and I've seen a lot of things swept under the rug, behavior explained away, apologies made quietly, if at all, a breath. But what happened today? That won't disappear when we land. You have my word." Avery held her gaze for a long time. "Then what makes you say that Lena didn't flinch? Because I'm tired of flying above it. I'd rather stand in it." Avery's lips curved, just slightly, but it was the first real smile in hours, somewhere over the Atlantic. Flight AL 417 hummed on through the night. But in its cabins and cockpits and galleys, awakenings were happening. Confrontations weren't over. Consequences weren't yet handed down. But something had changed. The woman in seat 3A, once invisible, then targeted, was now undeniable. Not because she revealed her title, but because she revealed her humanity and forced everyone around her to confront their own. Morning light had begun to creep across the edge of the sky. A soft, lavender glow tinted the clouds outside the windows of Flight AL-407. But inside the cabin, it was another kind of dawn, one not marked by time, but by reckoning. Sleep was scarce. Eyes had closed, but minds stayed wide open. Because when you witness injustice with your own eyes, when you watch the powerful be mistreated, and the guilty fumble with denial, rest becomes a luxury. Reflection becomes a need. And for Jade Merrill, reflection had become unavoidable. She sat alone in the back galley, the kettle beside her humming quietly. But she wasn't making coffee. She was making a choice. For hours, she'd rehearsed what she might say. To her crew, to her passengers, to the woman she struck, and to herself. There were no excuses left to hide behind. The uniform didn't shield her anymore. Not after that moment in 3A, not after that slap. What she did had gone viral across the eyes of the entire plane, even if no camera had caught it. The memory of that sound, that sharp silence afterward, it echoed louder than a recording ever could. And the worst part, she hadn't slapped a CEO. She had slapped a human being. A woman who had said nothing cruel, who had not shouted, not resisted, only asked for water, with grace, with patience. and that quiet strength had frightened Jade more than any outburst could have, because it forced her to look inward, and she didn't like what she saw. In seat 3A, Avery Langston looked down at the airline-issued notebook in her lap. She'd asked a junior attendant for it hours ago, no questions, no tone, just a simple request. Now it sat half-filled with thoughts that barely made it past the weight of her own restraint. But on page 7, one line stood alone. I wasn't angry when she slapped me. I was disappointed it still happens. Avery had weathered worse storms, boardroom betrayals, legal threats, racial slurs veiled in business speak. But the thing that stung deepest wasn't the act, it was the casualness of it. The way Jade had done it with certainty, like it was her right, like Avery had no place where she sat, no voice worth hearing. And the silence from the rest of the crew in that moment, that was what scraped the soul. But one person had finally spoken up, Lena Navarro, the only one willing to sit beside her and say, I see what happened, and I'm not okay with it. Avery had remembered her name. She always remembered names. Because leadership wasn't about titles. It was about accountability. And soon, it would be time to test whether anyone else on this flight understood that. At row 9, Noelle Stroud watched it all unfold with the quiet focus of someone who knew how stories lived. They didn't die in the news cycle. They didn't fade with landing gear. They lingered, and they shaped the next story, the next headline, the next moment someone chose to speak or not. Noelle's pen had stopped hours ago. Now, she was just listening to the shifting of weight in seats, to the hesitation in Jade's footsteps, to the glances from passengers trying not to stare, but staring anyway. And she wondered, would the apology come? Would the mask drop? Would the real Jade stand up? Or would this flight become another forgotten chapter? At the front of the cabin, Captain Theo Vance was pacing outside the cockpit door. He wasn't a man who got involved in cabin politics often, but this wasn't politics. This was principle. He glanced toward the seat 3A, then toward the galley, where Jade now stood holding something in her trembling hands. Not water, not coffee, a tray with a linen napkin, a silver spoon, a sealed bottle of spring water chilled just right, and a folded note. Jade walked slowly toward Avery's seat. The cabin quieted again, tension returning like cabin pressure dropping ever so slightly. Some held their breath, others whispered, but Avery didn't flinch. She looked up. Jade paused beside her, her voice barely more than a whisper. I owe you more than this. But may I please speak? Avery tilted her head. Go ahead. Jade placed the tray on the extended table. Then she placed the note beside it. I let something ugly drive me yesterday, she said. Something I thought I'd outgrown. I was wrong, and I hurt you. Not just because of who you are professionally, but because you're a person who deserved better. Her throat tightened. Avery waited. I can't undo the slap, Jade continued, but I can make sure it never happens again. Not to you, not to anyone. She stepped back. No excuses, no begging, just truth and choice. Avery looked down at the note. She opened it slowly. It read, Sometimes we slap the mirror because we're afraid to look at what it reflects. I'm ready to face it. I'm ready to change. Jade Merrill. Avery folded the note again and slipped it into her notebook. She didn't say thank you. Not yet. But she nodded once, and Jade, for the first time in hours, breathed again. In row 11, Connor Dre held up a drawing. This time it was of the woman in 3A, handing light to someone else. His mother smiled softly. "I think he gets it," she whispered, and Noel, 2 rows ahead, wiped a tear before it fell. As the plane edged closer to descent, it wasn't clear what the aftermath would be. Disciplinary action. Possibly a press release. Maybe, but something more important had already happened. A mask had dropped, not just for Jade, but for the crew, the passengers, the system itself, and maybe, just maybe, this flight would land different than it took off. The first note of turbulence arrived gently, a subtle shift, a trembling of the tray tables, a soft chime overhead. It was time. The seatbelt signs flickered back to life, casting a quiet blue glow through the morning hush. But the true descent wasn't just altitude, it was emotional gravity. The moment when everyone on Flight AL417 had to ask, "What happens now?" Avery Langston sat with her hands resting softly over the notebook in her lap, her spine still upright, her gaze still serene. But inside, her thoughts churned. She'd accepted Jade's apology not with fanfare, but with grace. That didn't mean she was done thinking or deciding. As CEO, she had power. She could land this flight with silence and let corporate protocol handle it. Or she could land it with action visible, immediate, unshakable, but which would truly change anything. She looked out the window. The sun had risen fully now, gold bleeding into blue, even above the clouds. Truth had a way of finding light. At the rear galley, Lena Navarro gathered the last of the breakfast trays. Her hands moved efficiently, but her thoughts lingered in the middle of the cabin. She'd seen Jade's apology, heard every word, and while it had been sincere, it was incomplete, because an apology without transformation was a whisper in a storm. Lena knew the industry, knew the cycles of denial and deflection, knew how many passengers had been mistreated, dismissed, reduced to incidents in reports. But this one was different, because this time, the victim wasn't just any passenger, it was the founder. Meanwhile, Jade Merrill sat 2 rows behind Avery, staring at her folded hands. Her throat was sore, not from speaking but from the weight of restraint. There was more she wanted to say, more she needed to understand about herself, about why she'd acted the way she had. What was it that made her assume? Was it race-age simplicity of dress? Or had it been something even deeper? Her own bitterness at the life she felt cheated out of. The promotion she hadn't gotten. The invisible wounds she carried from passengers who had mistreated her. "Maybe I've been walking around with bruises so long," she whispered to herself. "I didn't notice when I started bruising others." She didn't expect forgiveness, but she craved clarity, and in that clarity, maybe redemption. At the front of the plane, Captain Theo Vance received a message on his cockpit screen. A private note from Ground Operations Press has been alerted. CEO may be on board. Prepare statement. Do not comment. He exhaled through his nose. So, they knew. Even before the plane touched the tarmac, the world was watching. Theo had flown through hurricanes, once navigated a dual-engine failure over the Rockies, but nothing quite prepared a man for corporate turbulence, especially when ethics and image collided mid-air. Row 9. Noelle Stroud finished jotting her final notes. Apology witnessed. Passenger responded with restraint. Crew divided, but watching closely. Power structures exposed. Dissent equals decision. She closed her journal and tucked it into her messenger bag. Noelle wasn't just documenting the story. She was waiting to see who, at the end of it, would become the story. 3 rows behind Avery. Connor Dre tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom." She looked down. "Yes, baby, I think the lady in front is a superhero." His mother blinked. "Why's that?" She didn't yell, and the mean lady looked scared. But then the scared lady said, "Sorry, that's what superheroes do, right? They help people see better." His mother's throat closed tight. Maybe this flight hadn't just changed policy. Maybe it had shifted how a little boy saw courage. The landing gear locked into place. And for the first time since takeoff, Avery leaned slightly forward. She pressed the call button overhead. A chime rang out. Jade approached. Her eyes met Avery's cautiously. "Yes, ma'am. I'd like to speak with you, and with Lena, and the captain. Before we disembark." Jade nodded once. "I'll make it happen." As the wheels touched the runway, a hush fell over the passengers. It wasn't just the usual pause for landing. It was anticipation of headlines, of justice, of whether truth would disembark with them or stay trapped in the recycled air of flight AL-417. The aircraft rolled gently to the gate. The seatbelt sign clicked off, but no one stood, not yet, because Avery Langston rose slowly from seat 3A, turned, and looked at everyone watching her, and she said quietly, "Before we exit, I'd like just a few moments of your time. I believe we all shared something important today, and I think it deserves to be honored with truth." The moment Avery Langston stepped into the aisle, silence settled over the cabin, not the awkward hush of social discomfort, but the stillness that follows a gathering storm. Seatbacks stayed upright, bags remained untouched. Every eye on Flight AL-417 turned to her. She was no longer just the woman in 3A. She was a presence. Avery didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I want to thank each of you for your patience this morning. I know this flight began with tension, confusion, and for many of you an uncomfortable window into something that happens far too often in silence." She paused. Behind her, the crew stood Jade Merrill, pale but composed, Lena Navarro, steady as ever, and Captain Theo Vance, hands behind his back, face unreadable but attentive. Avery continued. "What happened to me was not the worst thing a passenger can experience, but it was a reflection of something deeper, something we have allowed to fester within this industry and beyond. It's a pattern, a culture." A few passengers nodded subtly. One woman placed a hand on her chest. Assumptions were made, not about my ticket, but about my worth, and that assumption led to action, violent, unprofessional, and unnecessary. Her gaze swept the rows. Now, I could have demanded punishment. I could have made an example out of someone in front of you, but I'm not interested in performative justice. She turned, briefly, to look at Jade, whose hands trembled slightly at her sides. "I'm interested in something harder and much more valuable. Transformation." From the back, someone whispered, "Damn." Avery smiled faintly, then stepped aside. "Jade," she said gently, "if you're willing, I believe these passengers deserve to hear from you, too." Jade's breath hitched. Her feet refused to move. Every voice inside her screamed, "Don't stand. You'll just make it worse." But then she felt a light hand on her shoulder. Lena. And that was enough. She stepped forward. "I messed up." That was all she could get out at first. She swallowed, eyes glistening, but she didn't look away from the crowd. I made a lot of assumptions, and I did something that can't be undone. I let my own stress, my own bias, and my own resentment color how I treated another person. That person, being the CEO of this airline, just makes it more public, but it doesn't make it more wrong. Silence. And then I am so sorry. She looked at Avery, then back at the passengers. If you ever feel dismissed, unheard, judged, I see you, and I want to be better. The cabin stayed still for a long breath, and then soft clapping, just one person, then two, then a scattered wave, not loud, not performative, just human. Captain Vance stepped forward next, his voice cool and calm. On behalf of Astralinks Airlines, I want to reaffirm that our mission is not just to transport passengers, but to treat them with dignity. That includes admitting when we've failed. He looked to Avery. Ma'am, CEO Langston, I am deeply sorry. Noelle Stroud reached for her notebook and stopped. She knew this moment wasn't meant to be recorded. It was meant to be remembered. Connor Dre tugged his mother's hand again. Did the superhero fix it? She nodded, tears in her eyes. She's trying. Avery turned to Jade one last time. You'll be part of the internal process, but I want you to know this. I believe people can grow. I believe in second chances. What matters most now is what you do next. Jade nodded, speechless. The intercom buzzed. Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at Lisbon Humberto Delgado International Airport. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a full stop. The plane pulled gently into the gate, but no one reached for overhead bins just yet, because the real arrival had already happened somewhere between altitude and empathy. As passengers finally stood to disembark, many paused by Avery's seat. Some nodded, some whispered, "Thank you." A few touched her arm, eyes full of quiet understanding. Jade stood nearby, helping each one, with care this time, with humility. She was still shaken, but perhaps beginning again. Back in the cockpit, Captain Vance picked up his headset. Dispatch. This is Flight AL417. We've completed gate arrival. There was an onboard incident that was addressed directly by the CEO. A long pause. Then dispatch replied, "Understood." She already called the board. Theo smiled to himself. Of course she had. As the last passengers filed off, Avery turned to Lena. "Thank you for seeing me when others didn't." Lena replied with a warm smile. "That's the job, or at least it's supposed to be." Avery nodded once, and then she stepped off the plane, into a new chapter. For herself, for Jade, for everyone who'd been unseen for far too long. The moment her heels touched the jet bridge floor, Avery Langston breathed in the ground air, not stale like the recycled cabin atmosphere, but not entirely fresh either. It was the air of aftermath, of press conferences, of HR reviews, of lawyers circling in slow, well-dressed spirals. She rolled her shoulders once, then adjusted the strap of her carry-on. It was time to walk not just through an airport, but through fire, and she would do it without flinching. Inside the terminal, a tight cluster of executives, handlers, and legal representatives waited at Gate B7. Most of them had just learned moments ago exactly who had been on board. Simon Vega, her COO, approached first. His face was flushed and tight. "Avery, we're ready. Security's cleared a room. Legal's drafting statements. We've grounded the flight crew for internal review, including Jade. We also..." She raised a hand. "Slow down. He blinked. That was always her way. Calm in the middle of a corporate quake, she followed them into a private executive lounge, stripped of anything welcoming, glass walls, neutral carpet, the scent of expensive stress. Avery sat at the head of the conference table, not as the victim, as the leader. "We're not burying this," she said firmly, before anyone else could speak. "We're not spinning it. We're not minimizing it. And we're certainly not sacrificing one flight attendant to save face while ignoring the culture that enabled the moment." The room went still. Troy Halverson, head of corporate communications, cleared his throat. "Avery, I understand your position, but the shareholders will understand mine," she cut in, "or they'll be educated." She met every gaze at the table, one by one. Do we want to build a company known for quietly removing problems, or one that makes the problem visible, takes responsibility, and evolves in front of the world? There was a long silence. Then Simon leaned forward. "You're saying we go public, with everything?" "Yes," she said simply. "Transparency, ownership, reform. Meanwhile, in a small waiting area adjacent to crew services." Jade Merrill sat in a uniform that suddenly felt 2 sizes too tight. No one had spoken to her since she got off the plane. Not Lena, not the other attendants, not the pilot. Just silence and a directive to wait. She'd expected that. But the stillness around her wasn't punishment, it was uncertainty. Would she be suspended? Fired, blacklisted more than anything. Jade feared the answer she hadn't prepared for. What if she wasn't punished? What if she had to live with the responsibility of doing better? Lena Navarro stood just beyond the window, arms folded. She'd opted to stay behind when the others left, not to protect Jade, to watch, to see whether this experience had left a mark or just a bruise. The difference mattered. Back in the executive lounge, Troy's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then looked up. "The media has a story. It's spreading." Avery nodded. "Then we do it our way." She stood. "I want a statement drafted by tonight. In my voice. No legalese. We acknowledge what happened. We describe how we failed, and we state exactly how we'll change." Simon furrowed his brow. "And Jade. She'll have a say in how we move forward." The room froze. "She made a mistake," Avery said, "but she also apologized, publicly. And if we truly believe in transformation, it starts with how we treat her." Troy leaned back in his seat. "You're risking PR backlash." Avery's voice remained even. "I'm building a legacy, not a press cycle." That night, as Avery walked alone through the Lisbon hotel hallway, she stopped at her door and looked out at the horizon through the window. The city lights blinked like a runway. Somewhere behind her, Flight AL-417 had been scrubbed from departure boards. But it was already in motion, changing things. Whether the world was ready or not, the press conference wasn't held in a stuffy boardroom or behind a sterile podium. Avery Langston chose the hangar, an open space, exposed beams, grounded jets in the background. Not a stage, a statement. A row of cameras clicked as Avery stepped up, flanked by her team Simon Vega, Troy Halverson, and, to the visible surprise of some, Jade Merrill. Yes. She stood there, shoulders square, eyes forward, not proud, not defiant, present. Avery didn't read from a script. She spoke with a quiet strength that echoed louder than any microphone. 3 days ago, something happened on Flight AL-417, something that should never happen aboard any aircraft, let alone one bearing the values of this airline. She paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle. I was assaulted by a flight attendant, not physically injured, but humiliated. Assumed, dismissed. Murmurs stirred, cameras zoomed in. Avery continued, unfazed. But the story doesn't end there, because this isn't about a single moment. It's about a culture, about what we choose to ignore in the name of policy, of routine, or of comfort. We teach our crew how to respond to turbulence in the skies, but we rarely teach them how to confront the turbulence within themselves. She turned slightly, gesturing to Jade. This is Jade Merrill, the flight attendant involved in the incident. She's here today not because she's been exonerated, but because she has chosen to be accountable. She has participated in Astralinx's new Reconciliation and Transformation Initiative, a program that will include unconscious bias training, restorative engagement, and passenger advocacy certification. We are not hiding her. We are not firing her to make this disappear. We are choosing the harder path change. A reporter raised a hand. Ms. Langston, how can you trust someone who struck you to serve on your flights again? Avery met his eyes. I don't ask for blind trust. I ask for evidence, growth, action, and Jade has already begun showing that. Jade stepped forward, voice low but steady. I made a decision I'll regret for a long time, but I also made another decision I stayed. I owned it, and I'll do the work. Every day. Some applauded, others watched in silence, unsure what to feel, but a shift had begun. Not in headlines, in hearts. Later that evening, in a smaller debrief room behind the hangar, Avery removed her blazer and sank into a chair. Simon entered, tablet in hand. Initial media reactions are mixed. Some praise your leadership, others say you're too soft. She looked up. Good. That means I'm not performing for either side. He smiled faintly. The board's watching you closely. They should, and if they push back, she didn't hesitate. They'll be choosing between preserving a comfort zone or leading the future. That night, Jade sat alone in her temporary hotel room, replaying the conference in her head. She hadn't expected forgiveness. She still wasn't sure she deserved it, but she knew this. She wasn't invisible anymore, and that meant she couldn't hide. For the first time in years, she opened her old journal, the one she used to carry before uniform and protocol replaced reflection. She flipped to a clean page and wrote Day 1, not perfect, but real. Meanwhile, a story quietly trended on a parenting blog. My autistic son met a CEO on a plane. She changed everything. The post went viral, not because of power, but because of presence. A child had seen what adults often missed, and the world took notice. In a corner office back in New York, a high-level board member scrolled through the comments beneath a live stream of the press conference replay. He paused on one. This is what leadership looks like: honest, brave, inconvenient. He leaned back and started rewriting his next quarterly speech. Avery stood by her hotel window that night, eyes on the dark sky. Somewhere out there, planes still flew, but this time one carried more than passengers. It carried a promise. She could have fired them all. In a world that applauds power plays, she had every right to lash out, to make a public spectacle, to take revenge. But instead, she chose to stay silent in the moment, to listen, to reflect, to lead not by title but by example. Because real power isn't about control. It's about compassion and conflict, and in her stillness, she forced the world to stop and look in the mirror. This wasn't just about a seat or a slap. It was about how easy it is to judge someone by what they appear to be and how rare it is to unlearn that impulse. It was about bias in the skies, but more importantly about what it means to take accountability on the ground. Her story reminds us prejudice doesn't need a uniform to show up, but kindness doesn't need a title to take flight. If this story moved you, if it made you think twice about the quiet people around you, if it made you believe that change is still possible, then please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps stories like these reach the hearts that need them most. And remember, sometimes the most powerful seat on the plane is the one no one sees coming.